We had to lock up people without trial, whether they are communists, whether they are language chauvinists or religious extremists. If you don't do that, the country would be in ruins today. And let there be no mistakes about this. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I've spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down.
The fight with the British was the easiest because they were not putting up a fight. They just wanted to make sure that power was handed over to a group that wouldn't ruin the place and ruin their interests. The fight was with the communists who wanted a different system.
I take pride in the word history and iron feeling.
Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father and prime minister for 31 years, was known internationally as an effective but firm and authoritative leader who had a precise vision for what Singapore could become and stopped at nothing to achieve that vision. In this process, he often resorted to measures widely considered undemocratic and authoritarian by Western standards, particularly in the early days of modern Singapore's existence in the late 1950s and the decade that followed. As this period coincided with a time of rising Cold War tensions, Lee Kuan Yew, a political moderate who rejected ideology in favor of practicality, often found himself at odds with the communists, as well as those who were suspected to be communist sympathizers, whose ideological approach to politics clashed heavily with that of Lee Kuan Yew. This political rivalry and intense distrust between various political forces eventually reached its boiling point in 1963, when Lee Kuan Yew and other anti-communist officials, with the support of the Malayan and British governments, planned and executed Operation Coldstore, in a dramatic crackdown on Singaporean leftists. This is the story of how Operation Coldstore came to be, its impact on Singapore's subsequent development, and the legacy it left behind. To begin, let us return to the year 1960, when Singapore did not resemble at all the metropolis we know today. It was a time when this seemingly insignificant island was just emerging from its first year as a fully self-governing colony within the British Empire. At the top of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's agenda was ensuring Singapore's place in the proposed Federation of Malaysia, the creation of which was being actively negotiated at that time. If succeeded, Singapore would join Malaya, Sarawak, and North Borneo into one independent state. The negotiation process, however, proved to be extremely difficult, especially because of the troubles both within and without Singapore. Domestically, it was highly unstable due to political uncertainty, poor living standards, and an economy that was still severely underdeveloped. Internationally, the situation in the region surrounding Singapore wasn't looking so good either. The Malayan Emergency, a brutal guerrilla war that erupted in 1948 and went on for a total of 12 years until 1960, created tremendous unrest that spilled over to areas nearby. This conflict, fought between Commonwealth forces and a predominantly Chinese Maoist guerrilla army, also facilitated the widespread stereotype that equated ethnic Chinese in the region to communist sympathizers, further adding to the tension in Singaporean society at the time. Now, let us return to the timeline. 1 year after the end of the Malayan Emergency in 1961, Singapore's governing party, the People's Action Party, or PAP for short, to which Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was leader, expelled its left-leaning members after a period of growing internal schism. These expelled members then went on to form their own party, the Barisan Socialists, a firmly left-wing political entity. The Barisan Socialists, or BS for short, with its majority Chinese leadership and grassroots approach, was able to secure the support of the Chinese masses, and soon became one of the PAP's main political opponents. If you would recall my earlier mentioning of the stereotype that equated ethnic Chinese to communist sympathizers, it is obvious how the Barisan Socialists often found themselves labeled in that manner. Indeed, the PAP often claimed that the Barisan was a, quote, communist-controlled organization that had close links with the Malayan Communist Party. Whether or not this is an accurate characterization is a matter that's up for debate. However, it is certainly true that the Barisan was influenced by communist thought and tactics, specifically the Popular Front approach used by many communist organizations to gain support. Regardless of the degree to which the Barisan embraced communism, it is clear that they were a very successful organization. In fact, the party was so successful that it was even projected at the time that the Barisan Socialists will win an outright majority over the PAP in the next general election, taking over the latter's status as ruling party. It was against this backdrop that Lee Kuan Yew found himself more and more concerned about the Barisan Socialists and left-wing opposition in general. He believed that their communist inclination threatened not only the future of Singapore, but also his own hold on power. This sentiment was also shared by many of his fellow PAP officials, other regional leaders, especially those in Malaya, as well as the British, who were keen on ensuring the region did not turn communist after their withdrawal. In fact, the fear of a communist takeover was one of the reasons that pushed Lee Kuan Yew to seek for Singapore what he called independence through merger in the first place. Lee Kuan Yew was firmly convinced that only through Malaya and Singapore's combined might will they be able to counter the threat of the Barisan and communism in general. From late 1961 to 1962, the Barisan Socialists managed to make themselves an even larger thorn in Lee Kuan Yew's eyes with their hindering of the merger negotiation process. The Barisan did not oppose the idea of Singapore joining the Malaysian Federation, but they strongly disagreed with Lee Kuan Yew's vision of how the merger should happen and on what terms. Beyond that, the growing popularity of the Barisan Socialists was also causing the Malays to have second thoughts about absorbing Singapore. They were worried that if Singapore joined the Federation, then afterwards a Barisan government came to power, Singapore would become a source of political unrest and security concern for the rest of Malaysia. Then there's the British. For them, their primary concern regarding a potential Barisan government is that they would be far less willing to negotiate and cooperate compared to a PAP government. Britain very much wanted the ability to maintain a military presence in Singapore post-independence as their base of operation in Southeast Asia, which a Barisan socialist government would most certainly not agree to. Thus, the Barisan Socialists, whose political agenda and social base drew intense suspicion, were quickly becoming the prime target of political repression. At the same time, the Malays, represented by Prime Minister Tunku, began to insist that an arrest program be made one of the essential preconditions for the merger. Consequently, in April of 1962, the Malayan and Singaporean special branches came together and drafted up a plan for the arrest of leftist opposition figures when the time was right. The British, however, were hesitant. They told both Prime Minister Tunku and Lee Kuan Yew that a crackdown would not be justifiable in the eyes of the public, domestically or internationally. Britain was also worried that repressive action like this would create support for the very opposition whose strength they sought to weaken. Furthermore, the British also expressed doubt about whether or not leading members of the Barisan Socialists, such as Party Chairman Lee Soo-chow, as well as Secretary General Lim Siong, were truly communists. Disagreeing with the Singaporeans and the Malays, the British argued that not only was the evidence against these men considerably stale, but the Barisan Socialists had always kept illegal methods of political activity. The British also sensed that Lee Kuan Yew had ulterior motives, and that this proposed arrest program was not just for security concerns. As commented by the British Commissioner of Singapore, Lord Selkirk, Lee Kuan Yew is quite clearly attracted by the prospect of wiping out his main political opposition before the next general elections. Despite all this, the British eventually caved in to the demand for a crackdown, as Prime Minister Tunku was prepared to give up the merger project if this did not go through, and the British were desperate to shed their responsibilities as colonial overlord. That being said, a justifiable pretext for the crackdown still needed to be found. Fortunately for Lee Kuan Yew and his fellow conspirators, Lim Siong would himself present this pretext when it emerged that he had a meeting with a certain A.M. Azahari in Singapore on the 3rd of December 1962, who, just 5 days later, will lead a popular uprising in nearby Brunei. Further adding to the suspicion against them, the Barisan Socialists as a whole also expressed support for the revolt, which led the Singaporean Special Branch to conclude that the Barisan Socialists was plotting an immediate coup of a similar fashion in Singapore. This turn of events offered what Lee Kuan Yew reportedly called a heaven-sent opportunity of justifying action against them. Sensing the moment to strike was approaching, another meeting was called between the Malayan and Singaporean governments. Together, they finalized the number of people to be arrested at 169 and set the date for Operation Coldstore's execution for December 16, 1962. The day before, however, on December 15th, communication between Lee Kuan Yew and Prime Minister Tunku suddenly fell apart, after Lee repeatedly pressed him to include on the arrest list Malayan members of parliament who opposed the merger. Prime Minister Tunku rejected this request and subsequently withdrew the Malayan delegate from the Internal Security Council. Lee Kuan Yew, perhaps out of a mix of frustration and exhaustion, went away to vacation in Malaya's Cameron Highlands, with no way to be contacted. At that point, it seemed like Operation Coldstore was over before it began, and even the merger to create Malaysia appeared to be in jeopardy. Over the next 2 weeks, however, Lee Kuan Yew was persuaded to reopen dialogue with Prime Minister Tunku. Eventually, the two were able to find common ground, and a new date was set for Operation Coldstore, this time on the 2nd of February 1963, right before Lunar New Year. Lee Kuan Yew chose this date himself, believing that the festival would dampen any social discontent caused by the operation. When that fateful day finally arrived, Operation Coldstore swung into action. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy fist of special branch officers began pounding on doors across Singapore and rounded up around 100 individuals, the majority of whom were Barisan Socialist members and trade unionists, including Secretary General Lim Siong. There were several individuals whom the government wanted to arrest but managed to escape. However, most of them would be captured in a later and smaller operation. The Internal Security Council then released a public statement justifying their action by accusing the detainees of acting in the interest of the Malayan Communist Party, with the goal of infiltrating the government and trade unions to bring about a communist revolution. The government also argued that the arrests were well within the provisions of the Preservation of Public Security Ordinance, which allowed for preventative action. After the dust has settled, each of the detainees was held in solitary confinement until their interrogation had been completed, the process of which was noted by the British and concerned members of the Singapore Assembly as being unreasonably protracted. The detainees had no access to working toilets, and their minuscule cell consisted of one small light bulb on the ceiling and a chamber pot. Then came the 22nd of April, when remaining Barisan members, led by Lee Soo-cho, the party chairman, staged a protest march on the Prime Minister's office. They too were arrested and charged with attempting to overthrow the government. By late May of 1963, when an investigating team consisting of Labour Party MPs from Britain arrived, there were still 35 suspects from Operation Coldstore being held without trial. One member of the investigating team, Fenner Brockway, criticized the condition in which the detainees were being held, most of them in Singapore's Changi prison. Amnesty International also protested the treatment of the detainees from London, but to no avail. While some detainees, such as the Barisan chairman Lee Soo-cho, were acquitted relatively early on, many were held for much longer. Lim Siong himself was held until 1969, some 6 years after his initial arrest. During his imprisonment, his health deteriorated, and he began suffering from depression, high blood pressure, and heart problems. He became disillusioned with communist ideas, and following his attempted suicide, Lim Siong was released from prison on the condition that he give up politics for the rest of his life. He was released alongside Wan Chu-wan, a fellow detainee and the woman he was engaged to. They married in 1970 and moved to England, where they worked odd jobs, at one point selling fruits in London, but Lim's health never did recover. He and his family finally returned to Singapore in 1984. He passed away in 1996 from a heart attack. Upon hearing Lim Siong's passing, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who knew him since long before the two became rivals, back when they were campaigning against British colonialism side by side, wrote to Lim's now widow, Wan Chu-wan. The letter said the following: "I have just read that Siong died of heart attack on Monday, 5th of February. I got on well with Lim Siong from the time we first met in 1954. He was shy, soft-spoken, modest, serious man, and a hard worker. he fought tenaciously for his beliefs and for his side. The only way we, the non-communists, could counter his attacks was to match his determination, tenacity, and stamina. I was sad to hear that he has died at a relatively young age. My wife and I send our condolences to you and your 2 sons. We hope they will live up to the promise that their father showed and would have achieved had he been on the non-communist side. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew also wrote an obituary for Lim Siong, the last 2 paragraphs of which read, "I last met Siong one evening on 23rd of July 1969 at Sri Tamasak. He had written to ask to see me. I found him deeply disillusioned with the MCP and Communist United Front. We discussed his changed position and his decision to leave for London for studies. I wished him well for the future. We had personal regard for each other. When he returned to Singapore in the 1970s, he sent me New Year greeting cards every year. I returned his good wishes. Like thousands of idealistic, bright and promising young men and women of his generation, he has expended the best years of his life in the Malayan Communist Party's futile bid to overthrow the system in Malaya, including Singapore, and create a communist state. Their ideal society where no man would exploit his fellow man, and each will give what he can and receive what he needs. The tragedy was that they believed that communism, as practiced in the Soviet Union and China, was then on their way towards this ideal state. Just as with Lim Siong, the effects of Operation Coldstore on the Barisan socialists was devastating. When Lee Kuan Yew dissolved the Singapore Assembly on September 3, 1963, and called for a general election on the 21st of September, the Barisan was far too demoralized and unprepared to run an effective campaign. The PAP, on the other hand, had control of the mass media and access to superior funding, with Lee Kuan Yew framing the successful conclusion of the merger negotiations as a testament to his leadership abilities. The PAP won a decisive victory, securing 37 of 51 seats, compared to the Barisan, which only secured 13. From that point on, the PAP became the default ruling party of Singapore, a position that it still holds today. In fact, from 1965 to 1981, a total of 16 years, the PAP was the only political party represented in Parliament, and Lee Kuan Yew came to be widely seen as an authoritarian leader, albeit a very effective and benevolent one. Of course, this political dominance could not have been sustained if the PAP had not delivered on its promises of material benefits, industrialization, and better livelihood to the Singaporean people. That being said, the reason why the PAP had the opportunity to succeed in the first place has a lot to do with Operation Coldstore. In many ways, this often forgotten chapter of Singapore's early history laid the groundwork for the party's lengthy hold on power in the years to come. For one, it set a precedent for the usage of security laws against political opponents and created an extremely uneven political playing field. In the years following Operation Coldstore, Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP continued the practice of arresting political dissidents, most notably in the case of Operation Spectrum, also known as the 1987 Marxist conspiracy, where 22 people accused of plotting to turn Singapore into a Marxist state were again arrested without trial. By removing their political rivals, Operation Coldstore also gave the PAP valuable space and freedom to exercise complete control over policy directions. Very rarely does a political party get to demonstrate its abilities and realize its visions without constraint or opposition. This allowed the PAP to formulate a special relationship with the Singaporean people, reinforcing its political dominance and giving the party a long-term advantage over others. Today, there remains an ongoing debate over whether the communist threat in the 1960s was truly as serious as the governments of Malaya, Singapore, and Britain portrayed it to be. While many argue that Lee Kuan Yew executed Operation Coldstore as a necessary measure taken to safeguard Singapore and secure its future, others see it as an act of self-preservation that caused lasting harm to many individuals. It is highly possible that these two narratives both simultaneously hold merit, and reality probably lies somewhere in between. There is also the fact that Lee Kuan Yew continues to be a deeply respected figure in Singapore for his undoubtedly impressive achievements, and criticism of his past actions understandably elicits strong responses from those who seek to preserve the late leader's legacy. Ultimately, the continued classification of most documents related to Operation Coldstore, accessible only to a limited number of selected historians, means that any assessment remains provisional, shaped as much by the absence of evidence as by what is currently known. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any thoughts on the story of Operation Coldstore or the legacy of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, feel free to let me know in the comments. As usual, if you would like to see more Cold War related content, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.